Let me welcome our next speaker, Patrik Fältström, Head of Security, Survivability, NETNOD. I'm sorry, this was an extremely complicated word for me. The stage is yours. A nice applause. Yes.
Thank you. It's actually difficult regardless of what language you use. So I work for NETNOD. You heard the word NETNOD a couple of times during this meeting. So what we are doing is that we are providing wholesale services to, like in the telco industry, time, frequency, DNS, IXPs, and whatnot. And the goal of the mission is to make the internet work so that all of you and all of us can provide good services that always work, and make sure the world fits together and stays together. So what we are doing is that, as an example of being alive, is that we have multiple points of presence. We have multiple points of presence in Sweden, as you see, and then in like 75, 80 other locations in the world, including here in Riga. So, and by having these multiple locations, you in the DNS world, you heard about Anycast, but we're doing similar things in all different kind of places. We are doing it in all different kind of protocols. And this is one way, by creating diversity and implementing things with the help of diversity. That's one important tool to use when you try to build availability. Because security is availability and correctness, and then confidentiality. A little bit too many people focus on confidentiality, I think. Confidentiality is a good thing, but the real question is, how do you survive? This is one of my favorite quotes. Another one is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So let's end up being a little bit more operational. This is a picture from Ukraine. It could be like from any location where you have the war. It was lucky that this one did not explode. We have talked a lot about the terrible war in Ukraine that the terrorist state Russia is conducting. But we have to remember that these kind of things might happen to us anyways. To some degree, a war is something, even for us in Sweden, or maybe even here, it is still far away, even though Ukraine is close. So why do we have to plan for it? Well, if we look at what actually happened around February 24, you've seen a couple of examples of this. Dimitri had an interesting example. If you look at the top, the red squares, that's the actual physical war. But in the blue squares, you see what happened in cyber. And there is a correlation in between. We do have a couple of academic papers that now demonstrate that by looking at what happened in cyber around 2014, we, who are engineers, could have understood what was going to come just by looking at the changes in routes. Okay, so the real world and the cyber world, or IT world, is really entangled with each other. Luckily, the people in Ukraine are great people. They are not only good at taking care of each other, they're also building a very, very robust and good infrastructure. This is the fiber network that just one of the large ISPs demonstrate that they are able to use. If I look at the fiber network that individual ISPs can use in Sweden, it is not as diverse as this. Which means that if we in Sweden end up having the kind of problem they had in Ukraine, this is one example where fiber was hit by a normal, like, cannon, okay? They go out there and they repair it. But they have such a good internet fiber infrastructure, so it didn't really affect them so much. If this would happen in Sweden, oh boy, we would have issues. So, but still, a war is far away. Why do you have to plan for it? Well, this is in Strasbourg, OVH data center. A data center caught fire. All the co-location in that center did go into pieces. You could not survive. The computers didn't survive. The storage didn't survive. As you see, the fire is pretty big. So they were supposed to have a second data center that was like far away. Enough distance to the second data center so that would not be affected if the first ended up being destroyed. Unfortunately, the distance was not enough. So a lot of people actually had a lot of problems. Another example, this is between Paris and Lyon, where someone just decided that fiber is something bad because they didn't like the ISP. They understand where the fiber is, so they open up so they get access to the actual fiber infrastructure, and they destroy this. This is another picture of the same event. Took a little bit longer to repair than the issues in Ukraine, actually, and France is not in war. It's just more complicated. This is in Denmark, another kind of issue. You have the large provider Cloud Nordic. This is Google Translate from Danish to English, and of course you cannot read this too small print. What happened was that the company was hit by ransomware, but it did spread not only in their own business logic, but also to the computers where the customers' websites and email were. So the instructions to customers is that, and remember here that the customers actually did buy service that they thought they had a storage there and backups and stuff. You either have to read back or restore from your own local backup, which of course people didn't have, or you have to go to Internet Wayback Machine to get your data. Maybe that was not really what people expected. So a complete disaster is something that you actually that can happen. You must plan for that. What do you do if you end up in a complete disaster? This is a train accident a few weeks ago in Sweden, and what's interesting with this incident is that you see the fiber here. The fiber actually still works. At least during the train accident, but I don't really know whether the people that are repairing the train, whether they understand that they should be very careful with the fiber. When I discussed the Swedish authority to look at train incidents, train and airplane incidents, I asked them to also look at the fiber themselves. There's something we can learn about how to install the fiber along the railroad. In that case, it would actually be a good learning experience to see what actually happened, to measure the fiber, to see what happened with the dampening, for example, when you have had such a physical stress on the fiber itself. But if we go back to the war in Ukraine and that kind of situations where we have an antagonist. And the reason why I want to talk about that is try to convince you that it's important to prepare. If we look at a simple diagram like this, where you have the time going along the x-axis, so we move towards the right, we have the effect of certain kind of stress along the y-axis. Traditionally impact in red, you see that you have small bumps, you have small things that are happening, you have people trying to, the adversary trying to poke in to see where the national boundary is, they try to maybe do some terrorist attacks here and there, and then ultimately you have sort of an invasion or something, the government and the state react, they call for elevated preparedness and ultimately war. This is sort of traditional way of a country to handle a stressful situation. Unfortunately, if we look at cyber on top of this, it looks like this. That the actions that the adversary and the enemy is doing is actually, they are doing things before the actual, for example, physical, if we end up in a physical war. Everything is happening before we have the call for elevated preparedness. And unfortunately, in many countries, including Sweden, the special legislation that you might have to actually do various actions outside of market economy, you don't have that legislation unless a call and a decision is being made in the parliament to be in elevated preparedness or in war. So everything we do in cyber, we need to do in a normal market economy legal context. Okay? And this is one of the big problems we have. It's really hard to cooperate and share information between private entities, between private and public, and between military and civil entities. We have, though, heard a couple of really good examples during this conference where people have managed to actually create various different kind of corporations. So I claim that the context which we are working in and why we are here is that we are trying to understand how we are going to be able to prepare together before we have the various legal tools like elevated preparedness and war to use to be able to save our countries. So If it's the case that we are looking at the stress level on cyber, it might be the case that we are deciding that if it is the case that the amount of stress above a certain level, in that case we do some specific cooperative things, or we might get special legislation. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, that normal level that we decide, like what is normal, that is also a psychological thing. If it is the case that a system goes down, for example, everyone has tried to buy a ticket to a popular music arena or something, and of course the system goes down because of high load. Of course you have problems with payments or ATM machines at the day when the salary is paid. This, together with influence operations, makes a society to increase the level of normal. And one of the most important things, I think, for media and for us in the society is to not change our acceptance level of what we think is okay regarding what is broken. We have a lot of disinformation campaigns from Russia, and we heard many, many examples during this conference. And one of the goals for those information campaigns is to increase our acceptance for broken IT systems. We cannot accept being lured into a situation where we think it's acceptable that the systems does not work. We need to keep the level and definition of normal as we have when we go into a more stressful situation. So the worst thing that can happen is that we start to accept a higher level of broken IT systems, because that is like being boiled like a frog. Okay? Another thing that I changed, congratulations to .LV, 30 years. I looked back 30 years and looked at what is the design of security on the internet. It was basically like this, right? You have your network, you have a firewall, and then we have the internet. Everything dangerous on the internet and everything okay was in the local network. Today, it looks like this, that we have all of these various tools and they hijack each other, and the firewall should probably be in the opposite direction, so you cannot exfiltrate information from your companies. So we have the Internet of Ransomware things, and as we all know, the S in IoT stands for security. So how do we handle this situation, given that we need to prepare? Well, I'm a member of the National Academy of Engineering Sciences in Sweden. We had a look at this. We looked at digitalization for increased competitiveness. And we discovered that one of the problems that many organizations have and many countries have is that we still build services according to pipes. We have like stovepipes, when in reality we have the internet architecture, which is more like a lasagna, that each one of us provides services in one layer. We have competitors within that layer, but we provide that as a service to people in higher layers, and we probably most certainly buy wholesale services or acquire wholesale services for entities lower in lower layers. This connection between the layers is a positive thing because you can focus on whatever you are good at. But on the other hand, it requires new kind of contractual agreements, new kind of procurement processes, and you need new kinds of SLAs and responsibilities. But if you do that the right way, then you actually might have much more control and might be able to get much more diversity. Think about anyone having a web server. What if they were forced to dig down their own fiber? We would not have many web servers, right? Instead, the web server is just using the internet, which is like another layer. And the internet moves over any ISP that is moving over any kind of fiber. That's a good thing. And that's why the World Wide Web is such good. So the layers are important. If we look at the various cyber strategies we have a security strategy in Sweden, not a cyber security, it's a security strategy from 2017 that we are still using. Some people even in Sweden say, this is old and this is not something to actually base our decisions on. I'm saying that's wrong. Look at this. To under all circumstances, defend Sweden's freedom, security, and right to self-determination. I showed this to other people in Sweden that are like at various meetings on should we do A, should we do B, and I showed just this paragraph and say, let this sink in, think about this, and call me tomorrow. And then we have various threats against these kind of things. Military threats, information, cybersecurity, digital threats, organized crime, terrorism, violent extremism, threats to energy supply and distribution, logistics, infrastructure, threats to health issues. All of these things are entangled, just like I did show, that you have these various disinformation campaigns and all of these kind of the new kind of warfare that we see nowadays. And an antagonist is using all different kind of methods, often in combination, to be able to break down whatever you are doing. When Sweden did wake up, we saw gazillions of consulting companies. Oh, cybersecurity, there is money in this. And a lot of people try to do security by doing PowerPoint presentations. I call them charlatans, and you have a lot of yeah, anyways. And they come with this like Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. This is, don't misunderstand me, this is an excellent model. But even as a person working with security all the time, I cannot say what the difference is between many of these steps. This is hard, so stop. There are easier ways. This is my Patrik model. This is my kill chain. It's supposed to say 1, 2, 3 there. I don't know what happened. I'm better in security than design of slides. My apologies. Anyways, step 1. Intrusion, the old firewall. Try to make sure that people don't get a foothold. Keep track of your passwords. Do whatever you have to do. Make sure that your systems are up to date. Upgrade your software. Do what you have to do. Upgrade things when you see new 0-day coming. But on the other hand, nowadays, we cannot protect ourselves completely. So you have to think about the risk that someone actually managed to get into your system and get a foothold. So what is the next thing you have to do? You have to protect against horizontal movement. Even if it is the case that someone managed to bypass your firewall, try to minimize the risk that he is actually moved sideways to wherever you have your sensitive information. And the third step, if it is the case that the enemy manages to move to whatever the sensitive information is, make it harder to actually exfiltrate data or minimize the risk that someone is encrypting the hard drives, or make it easier to restore if that is happening. So the actual effect, limit the consequences of the effect. So intrusion, horizontal movement, attack. It's enough to work with just those 3 things. I even succeeded, well, not even, just joking. At NetNode, I succeeded in these kind of things, I think. Like, we have an excellent system that takes care of these things. So the next thing to think about when you try to prepare is that we should not use the waterfall method. It is not the case that we start work on something and then we are done. Instead, we have a continuous security improvement process that we are using. If it is the case that you have some kind of event, any kind of event, it might not be an incident, take care of that, investigate what happened, do a post-mortem meeting. At the meeting, think about what did we do right, what did we do wrong, and the last thing, which I think is really interesting, where were we lucky? There is a difference between making the right decision in when the hair is on fire and being lucky. It's nothing wrong being lucky, but just talking about the different things is a good thing. And then, of course, you come up with, okay, we need to do these improvements, you evaluate them, you distribute them, you implement them, blah, 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 all those kind of things, you know, that kind of thing. If it is the case that you manage to get a continuous process like this, try to reuse that all over your organization. At NetNode, we started with the incident process, and now we're using that in other portions of the product development, just because we know one way of doing these kind of things. Use the same tools. Where do you use your ticket system? Where do you use your Jira system, etc. Reuse things so that your staff recognize themselves in whatever processes you have. Don't have different processes for different things. That like people just get confused. No one knows what URL to use on the browser. I am also team lead for one of the teams in Locked Shields, the NATO exercise, and Sweden. We did in 23. We had a team, Sweden and Iceland together, and we did win. We also have a team now, Iceland and Sweden 2024. And I got some questions in the corridor. What did you do in this process that you think was successful during the exercise? I did not think about like showing this because it ended up being too complicated, but just because some of you are probably interested in knowing, and probably you have studied a lot of this, you know the normal observe, orient, decide, act loop that many people have been using when they're doing various different kind of operations. There are some theories about using something which is a dynamic such loop, that you have a smaller feedback loop so that you can adjust your actions in each one of your turns when you're cranking the wheel. And that was something that we succeeded in doing. We also managed to run multiple of these wheels with different radios. So it's not the case that we in our organization, or in our team in this case, had a specific clock that was ticking for the decision-making process. Instead, we used different wheels with different speeds, so that anyone that was playing the whack-a-mole game, which of course was every participant in my team, they could rotate the wheel as fast as they were able to do. They didn't have to wait for the slow ones. So don't wait for the slow entities. Design whatever work and processes you have to be able to work as fast as possible. Whack-a-mole, the game of whack-a-mole, you succeed by whacking the mole as fast as you can. So when you then are doing this sort of preparation and risk management, you can use this kind of risk matrix. All of you have seen this. You make a decision of actually have an action. In this case, you decide to do action A so that you decrease the consequence of event number 3 actually happening and turning into an incident. So this is a good thing. What is important to know is that just by coming up with the risk matrix and having all of these actions, just by developing that one, even though you have not implemented the action, you have learned a lot. Because everything that is on the list of actions, including the ones that you have not implemented, they are known issues that can happen. As Rumsfeld said, the important thing is to decrease the amount of unknown unknowns. So just walk through things. Another good thing that is a psychological thing that you have to deal with in your organization is that psychologically, they need to be able to sleep at night even though you have actions that you want to do that you have not implemented. You will always have an infinite number of things that you want to do, and being a person in theoretical math, if you have an infinite number of things and you remove 10, how many things do you have left? And the answer is an infinite number. So you don't have to make those 10 things. Go home, take care of your kids, come back tomorrow and continue to work. You will always have an infinite number of things that you would like to do. Another good thing with risk matrices that I don't see as much as I would like is that when you have one of those matrices, it's a perfect picture to give to your boss. Because instead of writing that 55-page document to each board meeting on what you have succeeded to do or not, just have a picture like this and have small arrows to demonstrate in what direction various things have moved. And then maybe, oh, wait a second, has the probability for 5 increased? Explain a little bit more about that. Much easier, make one picture, don't type in lots of words that people will not read anyways. And by the way, the words were probably generated by this picture from an AI, so why turn it into words? Why not just give the picture to your boss? Anyways, smaller reports, stay with the meat. So, to conclude, what gives success is a well-functioned, pre-planned coordination. Pre-planned is important. The more you plan, the less you need to coordinate during an incident. And remember, we who are in communication, when we have an incident, we might not be able to communicate. Okay? So it's very hard to have like a Zoom meeting and discuss what to do during an incident. We need to have prepared. And more robust communication, you achieve that through an in-advanced planned and practice coordination between actors. This is one of the reasons why I'm advocating for exercises like the locked shields and whatnot. It's so important. And in Sweden and the team, and also Iceland, we are rotating as many individuals as possible in the team, just because as many individuals as possible should be able to participate. We have new people all the time. Last year it was from the banks. The year before that, energy sector. Just rotate, make sure that everyone can do some kind of training. And this applies to everyone that works with anything that has to do with total defense activities. It doesn't have to be IT. Think about what can happen. What happens if you get a puncture of your truck? What happens if you run out of gas? What happens if whatever? And the difference between normal planning and cyber and IT, though, is that we in IT, we need to actually act long before, much earlier in the increased threat level than traditional sort of security situations. And that's something that we have to convince our governments about. Luckily, many of the armed forces in the world, including Swedish armed forces that I'm working with, they start to understand this. But there are other parts of the society that deal with market economy that think it's more important to actually solve issues with market economy than actually preparing your country for a worse situation. So, recommendations: 1, do a risk assessment and a scenario analysis. It's not important to actually implement things, but just go through a risk assessment. Develop the plans, deploy at least some of the mitigation strategies, but don't be afraid of having more than one. Use a cloud architecture. We heard that from Ukraine. You must be able to move your data and your CPU and your storage between geographical locations for various reasons. It might be a fire, it might be whatever happening. You have to use a cloud architecture. You also need to use a cloud architecture to be able to scale when you get a DDoS attack against your service, because we cannot accept that the new normal is that things are broken. You must use a cloud architecture. Might be the case very well, like we at NETNOD, you run things on your own cloud as long as you can handle the load. But if we need to expand, of course we need to expand somewhere else, or we move to some other country, just like we heard from UA Hostmaster. Use a cloud architecture. Don't get stuck in your own silicon that you cannot move. And last thing, remember that we are nowadays using lasagna. And lasagnas are good because even though you have different layers, the best taste you get is if you take a knife and cut through the whole of them and just eat. Thank you.
Patrik, please stay for a while. Obviously, there are a few questions. Now, question number 1 is, I would say, more on the philosophy side. Now, let's get back to your cite of, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Now, obviously, you can plan for everything, etc. Now, how do you approach, from the philosophical perspective, that thing? Because you plan, and you said you can't do infinite things. So either we are knowing that we will get punched in the face anyway, so we prepare the plaster. Or, okay, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. We don't care.
Okay. Unfortunately, too many people in their planning process, they come up with sort of 3 different things, and they immediately try to implement them. And they don't continue the planning just because they wait for implementation. I am really talking about doing the planning and go through everything that can happen to you. So there are too many people which stop planning just because they're waiting for implementation of things. The implementation phase for mitigation methods is not as important as the planning. And so that's what I mean. You should go through as many things as possible, so at least when you get punched in the face, oh, wait a second, it was just because I'm not a boxer, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you understand what actually happened, you're still prepared. Mm-hmm. You will not be surprised, and you need to limit the amount of surprise.
Good one. The second one is getting back to what you call lasagna.
Yep.
So can you, summarize to some extent the advantages of looking at it that way? Because, well, from the perspective, lasagna consists of layers. Yeah. So what's the point? One layer gets lost, everything else stays, or you mentioned another example, just cutting with the knife through. So these are all allegories, but maybe help us understand, and where's the point in having lasagna?
Let's give 2 examples. If you're an ISP in a country and you're responsible for communication, if you only send IP packets over your own fiber, that's quite expensive. But what you can do is that you can dig down fiber, use them, but you can also rent fiber for someone else. And that way you might get more diversity. That's one example. If we look at the DNS business that we're talking about here, you can do your own DNS hosting, but you can also buy for someone else as well. You can also buy DNS hosting from 2 other players, and that way you get more diversity. I'm going to take a cab to the airport, and I've seen that, oh, I can use both Bolt or taxi, or I can walk. Okay, I don't have to own my own car in Riga. So this increases my ability to actually be able to get to the airport. So you can increase. So you don't have, by not having to implement everything in every layer that actually is good for you. You don't have to write your own Excel program. You can actually buy it from Microsoft. So there are many things in which way where someone else is better than you. And even if you do something, for example, you host your own cloud and your Kubernetes things on top of Proxmox or whatever it is, you probably cannot really afford the investment of the hardware that you need to handle the most massive denial of service attack you can handle. You probably buy something like Overflow Cloud somewhere else.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much.